Today on the Bass Channel, we're discussing why active pickups are objectively superior to passive pickups. Before we get too deep into this is the part of the video where I tell you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know your thoughts. But I'm also legally obligated to let you know that this is technically a paid sponsorship, and the reason for that is because the pickups used in this video were sent to me specifically for this video, but we'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. First, we need to understand that there are essentially 4 different types of electronic setups for the electric bass guitar. The first and arguably most popular is the full passive setup, and this is what you've come to expect to find on old precision basses, jazz basses, Thunderbirds, PJs, and all similar types of setups. Passive pickups fed through passive controls. Now in this case, when we say passive controls, we're talking about cut only. The second setup, and probably the second most popular, is the passive pickup fed through active electronics, and this is something that you've come to find on something like a Stingray. And while I don't have a traditional Stingray in the room today, I do have this guy, which is pretty much the same setup. It's 2 similar MM-style humbuckers that are passive, fed through active electronics. So in this case, we have a volume, a blend, and active bass and treble. Now active in this case means that you can cut or boost. The third setup is the setup that we're going to be focusing on today, which is an active pickup fed into passive controls. Now the active pickup is typically covered in black plastic and powered by a 9-volt battery, whereas the controls are still full passive, meaning cut only. The fourth and final setup is probably the least popular, or it's the one that I've seen less of than the other 3, which is an active pickup fed into active electronics. So in that case, both the pickup and the onboard EQ are both powered by a 9-volt battery. So now that we understand the 4 different types of bass setups, let's get into why active pickups are objectively superior to passive pickups. If you've done any amount of research on this topic, you've most likely come across some forum post or somebody somewhere basically stating that they dislike active pickups because they sound bright, harsh, cold, lifeless, sterile. The buzzwords go on, but what does that really mean? I've been thinking about this topic for quite a while now, and I've gone through much deliberation with myself trying to determine what would be the best way to get this point across. And after years of thinking about this, I think the best way to start is to look at amplifiers. Now, you probably have a different amplifier setup than I do, but regardless, this is the sound that you're probably most accustomed to hearing. That's the sound of your bass through your amplifier head, into your cabinet, and out of your speaker. Now in this particular example, I am miking the speaker with an Electro Voice RE320, mostly because of the microphones that I have in my arsenal, it is the flattest as far as its frequency response. But my favorite microphone is the Shure Beta 52. It's designed for kick drums and other low frequency instruments and definitely imparts its own character. Now that sounds like this. Whichever of those 2 microphones you prefer, it is pretty much irrelevant at this point, considering that once you get to the gig or the recording session, the front of house engineer or recording engineer is most likely going to plug an XLR into your amp to get the pre-EQ direct out, which is going to sound like this. So the big question becomes, why would the engineer want that sound? As you heard, you could probably describe that sound as cold, lifeless, harsh, and dare I say sterile. The only true sound in your entire signal chain is your string. Everything that comes after it is imparting its own tonal character, whether it be the pickup, the amp, the speaker, the microphone. I'm intentionally leaving wood out of this because that's just going to open up a whole other can of worms that we're going to save for another video. So while I will agree that that Shure Beta 52 on that 10-inch speaker sounded awesome on its own or maybe in your rehearsal space, it doesn't really leave a lot of room to tweak your sound to fit the mix or the venue. The sound that you got is basically the sound that you get, so any hopes you had of maybe doing some last-minute tweaks to help you cut through in the top end or finding that perfect mid-range frequency is pretty much gone at this point. However, the pre-EQ direct signal solves this problem perfectly. Rather than relying on a series of inanimate objects to manipulate your tone, you can actually have somebody who knows what they're doing sculpt your sound to fit any particular situation. And really, this method of doing things has come to be expected and accepted at this point. So now that we can agree and understand that, let's move on to the pickups. To elaborate on what I said earlier, I reached out to EMG to help me with this video for a couple different reasons. First off, they are my favorite pickup manufacturer. That's not to say that other pickup manufacturers are bad, there's everything out there for everyone, but for me, EMG just kind of does it. Second is that all of their pickups, whether they be active or passive, utilize solderless connections, which for me just meant one less headache into putting this video together. And finally, and most importantly, is they're pretty much the original. When you think of active pickups, who comes to mind before EMG? Those three letters are basically synonymous with active pickups at this point. And yes, there's plenty of other manufacturers utilizing that technology in their line, but really for my money, you can't beat the original. So like I said earlier, this is our test bass, and I went with this for a couple different reasons. Most importantly is it features a single P pickup, which is a sound that over the last 60 or so years, we've all become pretty familiar with. And in this video, we're going to feature two different pickups. On the passive side, we have the Butler Signature P pickup. Now this pickup is passive, it has exposed pole pieces, and utilizes an Alnico 5 magnet. And if you've been a fan of our channel for any time, you've probably heard them because we feature them in this bass right here behind me. That's the Butler Signature PJ set, and as you probably know, they sound killer. And on the active side, we have EMG's original recipe Ceramic P. This was the first active design in the precision bass lineup. All magnetic pickups, whether they be passive or active, are built upon the same foundation: magnets and copper wire. By playing with magnet strength, magnet materials, the number of winds of wire, and the thickness of wire, you can influence the tone and output of the pickup. Stronger magnets and more wire will give you higher output, but typically sacrifice sustain and or clarity. Now, I'm not a pickup builder, engineer, or scientist, so a lot of what I'm gonna say just kind of paints with broad strokes and touches on the theory, but essentially, stronger magnets and more turns of copper wire is generally going to result in a higher output, but sacrifice in clarity. Conversely, if you go with a weaker magnet and or fewer turns of copper wire, you're definitely going to start to get some of that clarity back, but sacrifice the output signal. So finding the sweet spot of sustain, output, and clarity is definitely where the art of pickup manufacturing comes into play. Active pickups still utilize magnets and wire, but introduce an internal preamp inside the pickup itself. Because the preamp does the heavy lifting in terms of output, active pickups are able to use fewer turns of wire and or weaker magnets to retain all of the clarity and sustain while still having enough output for any application. It's the tonal equivalent of having your cake and eating it too. In addition to providing me with the pickups I needed to produce this video, my new friend Anthony from EMG sat down with me over Zoom to provide validation and elaboration for some of these claims.
The features that really set active pickups apart is that the magnet strength can be a little bit less because the signal is being amplified by an onboard preamp. That preamp generates a lot of the output that you're used to hearing from an active pickup without having to have like the world's strongest magnets in there, because if you were to put stronger magnets inside the coil to produce more output, you could potentially also be having more string pull. So that can have not so desirable effects on your sustain. The other benefit of having a preamp to generate the high output levels in an active pickup is that the coil itself does not have to be wound quite as many times, because and this gets into one facet of a coil called inductance, which is not something that a lot of people talk about when they're talking about pickups, but inductance is essentially the strength of a magnetic field as informed by the number of turns, the aperture of the coil, whether it's like a thin coil or a big fat round coil, and like how tall it is versus how shallow it is. So you can have all other aspects of a pickup's construction be consistent. The total DC resistance, for example, could be the same. You could use the same magnets, but the actual like physical dimensions of the coil itself will play into the inductance. The more inductance you have, generally the more high-end frequencies you lose, but you can manipulate that a little bit based on the type of wire that's in the coil. So I'm going on and on and on listing all these different variables, but it really is like there's many different pieces of the picture that go into what the particular tone of a pickup is. But because you're adding inductance by adding more turns and you're adding a little bit of resistance as well, those overwound pickups are going to have a little bit of a darker sound. And by darker, I mean that there's less emphasis on the high ends. You're losing a bit of those natural high ends that are coming from the strings and from your playing. You're losing that to the increased inductance by overwinding a pickup. And you can go to the other end of the spectrum. You could have something like a gold foil pickup, for example, is a good example of a very like bright sounding low output pickup traditionally. And that has to do with it kind of going in the other direction, being wound a little less than your average pickup.
So we've kind of touched on the tone, which I do want to get to the merits of having more high end later. But can you tell me a little bit about, with the fewer turns of the wire, what does that do in terms of helping the pickup be quieter and more resistant to outside interference?
The active pickups, because they have what's called a lower output impedance, the amount of noise that gets introduced to the signal is generally less with the lower impedance you go. But of course, having a low impedance signal that isn't just weak and faint and low output requires active electronics, or benefits tremendously by having active electronics. So you're amplifying the signal earlier in the chain so that by the time it gets to your amp, you're not amplifying all the noise that got in along the way. From the cable, from the pots themselves, can be subject to just getting blasted with some stray there's electromagnetic noise all around us. Right now, I'm underneath some fluorescents, and those are notorious for just pumping out noise. I sometimes hear from people who just doing like tech support calls where they just cannot figure out what's going on with the noise in their instrument, especially if it's a passive pickup. And one of the first questions I'll ask them is, are you playing in a room that's loaded with a bunch of fluorescents? Because you might want to try moving your amp to somewhere else to see if just something in your rig is getting blasted by this noise.
Okay, passive purists, here's an olive branch. I will agree that a vintage pickup with exposed pole pieces does look pretty awesome, despite its intrinsic flaws. This is the original pickup that came out of our test base, and as you notice, there's really not much keeping this cover onto this pickup other than the tension of the screw when it's installed. Underneath this loose plastic cover is essentially just a piece of tape that protects those copper wires from anything that could potentially go wrong at a gig. Whether it's dirt, sweat, beer, anything can go wrong at a gig. Just ask Nick Maffei about the time that the upstairs toilet leaked through the ceiling onto them mid-song. So while most of us are probably lucky enough to say that that's never happened to us, there's still plenty of opportunities for unwanted debris to find its way into those coils, and once they do, it's pretty much history. I know there's some of you out there that just can't get past the look of an all-black hidden pole pickup, but I promise you there's plenty of advantages to that design. I'm fairly certain this goes for all active pickups, but just in case I'm mistaken, let's stick to EMG. Unlike traditional passives, these pickups are sealed in epoxy. This basically guarantees that no sweat, dirt, beer, or toilet water will make its way into the coil. EMG puts an official lifespan of 15 to 20 years on their pickups, but I'd honestly be surprised if they didn't outlive you. So either way, whether it's 15 years or 1500 years, you can rest assured knowing that your investment is well protected.
That's a good one. Honestly, the mechanical protection is a big part of the lifespan of the pickups. So pickups that have exposed pole pieces or open coil design in particular, like I know aesthetically it looks great to have like a really hot looking open coil pickup, but like it is prone to possibly getting some moisture, and especially if you go through a bucket of chicken before you're set, you're gonna get some grease up in there, and the pole pieces or the magnet, something inside the pickup can like get exposed to the elements and start to degrade over time. I sweat a lot when I play, and I did not go to Berklee School of Music. I do not have good technique. I keep my fingers anchored on the pickups when I'm playing, and like I've definitely like even the EMG logo on my pickups now, it's been like 5 or 6 years. It's started to like smear off from like how much I've sweat over and stuff. So it's nice to know that I'm not damaging any of the guts of this pickup by how much abuse I'm putting them through. There's definitely solid cap pickups out there, 81s and 85s, that they're in people's guitars before we even switch to the solderless system. So like going on 20, 30 years, some pickups I've come across, and they sound like something that came fresh off the floor.
Now, up to this point, you may or may not have agreed with everything that's been said, but really that's only half of the equation. At this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, yes, but what about the tone? Here's the thing, if you think active pickups sound bad, you're most likely using them incorrectly. It's really as simple as that. Much like our amplifier example from a few minutes ago, the active pickup is giving you much more of everything, just like your DI signal. Sure, if you put an active pickup in your bass and just plug it in and don't touch any of the knobs, it's gonna sound unfamiliar to you. I'm intentionally trying to stay away from words like good and bad because at the end of the day, those are ultimately subjective, so we'll settle with unfamiliar. Much of the criticism thrown at active pickups is that they sound cold, bright, harsh, lifeless, and the ever-exhausting sterile. But just like your DI signal, they're honest. They're giving you much more of your instrument sound than you're used to hearing, and that's the beauty of them. Now when you start shaping your tone, you can almost exclusively use subtractive EQ to sculpt your tone into just about whatever you want. So whether you want more bite at 3 kilohertz, maybe a little more fullness around 500 hertz, or some top-end clank and sizzle somewhere between 4K and 7K, it doesn't matter because now we have all the frequencies. Now, I know some of you are probably going to make the rebuttal of it's bass, it doesn't need any treble. Well, before we go there, I challenge you to take a picture of your amplifier settings. I guarantee that most of you, genre permitted, probably have your treble and or high mid at or above the 12 o'clock position. Now this might be to just balance out your tone, get a little bit more top end clarity, or maybe it's because some of you haven't changed your strings in like 6 months. The reason that subtractive EQ is ultimately a better method than additive EQ is because when you boost any of those particular frequencies, what you're doing is you're adding gain. And once you start to add gain, you're adding noise. Starting with more than you need and taking away is a much preferred way to mix because it gives you increased flexibility and of course, less noise. So again, to help back up some of my claims, I enlisted the help of my new friend Jeff Basso, who is a recording engineer here in Las Vegas with an incredible clientele list. And here's a little bit about what he had to say on the matter of subtractive EQ.
My name is Jeff Basso. I've been doing music, some sort of music in Vegas here since 96, 97. I started working in the UNLV studio and then worked my way up from a hired gun to a second engineer, to first engineer, all the way to head engineer. Yeah, the old adage is be careful how much you're adding because you can get into a hot mess later on when you keep adding EQ to bass and then the drums and then the guitars and the keyboards and vocals and everything just starts getting hotter and hotter and the frequencies are just getting all melded together. So yeah, you want to be conscious of carving out your EQs. And I remember going to school for it, they would always tell you, try to cut first as opposed to boosting. Let's start cutting because you can always add in later. So that's kind of a rule of thumb to start cutting. Don't add. See if you can subtract somewhere else to get the same tone because it will help you later in the mix. Usually if you have more, you can take away. As if you're trying to create something that's nothing there to begin with. If I have tones that are lacking on high end and I'm trying to add them later and they don't exist, I have nothing to pull from. The active picks are definitely going to be hotter. They're going to have more high end. They're going to be a little bit more bright. There's more there to work with, I guess is what we're getting at that point. You can mold it better at that point. I don't know why you would be against something like that. It's a cool technology that what's going on. It's a different tone, it's a different sound, it's a different tool in your toolbox. Why not have it there? Why would you want to limit yourself to certain things? Because I don't like that for whatever reason. No, utilize it, it's there. It's your tools, it's toolbox.
Some of this kind of like clinging to the old way of doing things musically, I get it. If someone has played passive pickups their whole life and they know their instrument and they know the way that their instrument responds to their playing. And especially if they've had a nice amp that they've dialed in the EQ that just works for them perfectly, and they know what they're getting. If someone's happy with that, then that's great. Now, yeah, if you were to go put a set of active pickups in it, and you think to yourself, "Oh my gosh, it's so bright, and I don't know what to do with all these highs," it's like, well, if the highs are driving you crazy, you go over to your amp and take that treble knob and dial it back, because there isn't a load being put on the signal in quite the same way as passive pickups. Because the inductance is lower and you're keeping more of those highs, the signal that's being generated by an active pickup is a closer representation of what's going on right at the interface of your fingers and those strings, or your pick and those strings, and the coil that's right beneath it, and your instrument. You're getting a truer representation of the sound that you are actually making with this hunk of wood that you got in your hands. Passive pickups, because of the inherent like high-end loss, I think people are kind of used to associating that, like, that's what a pickup should sound like. And if you like that sound, that's great, but you can always like adjust the EQ. You can always subtract the high-end frequencies to sculpt a warmer sound if you like that. It's much more problematic to try to like dial them back in without also dialing in a bunch of additional noise from whatever your EQ on your amp is producing.
Okay, and now the moment that we've all been waiting for, the tones. I recorded a handful of examples on both the active and the passive pickup, and now we're going to go into Logic Pro 10 to not only hear both of those in the context of a mix, but to show how easy it is to get the active pickup to sound just about identical to the passive. Alright, so this first example, let's start pretty easy. This is a heavier song tuned to drop C, for which I needed kind of a bright, aggressive, clangy, gritty, insert buzzword here type of tone. So I recorded this with both the active and the passive bass, and for this example we're using the DI signal, mainly because I'm using this Dark Glass plugin that just helps me kind of manipulate this after the fact, so I can just concentrate on recording while I'm recording, and then while I'm sitting here we can dial in the tone. So I pretty much have this tone in the ballpark of what I got originally when I recorded this song. Obviously I used a different style of bass with different pickups, so it's about as close as I can get considering this is just a straight piece. So let's start just by listening to the active pickup. Okay, so now let's move over to the passive. Again, same line, same bass. The only thing different is the pickup and the fact that I had to do a little bit of a different setting here to get the passive to sound in the ballpark of the active. So again, I was trying to go for getting these two tones as similar as I possibly could. So the first couple things we're going to notice is I needed to go a little bit of extra drive over here on the passive. Bass is about the same on both. Low mids I just left straight up. I didn't want to do too much processing, and in this particular example I kind of wanted to focus on the top end specifically. So as you'll see over here on the active, the high mids were just set neutral because I quite like the sound of the active EMG. However, on the passive, you'll see that there is a little bit more of a characteristic bump right around 1.5K. So I dipped that just a little bit to try to help these two pickups sound a little bit more similar. Now over here is where you will notice the biggest difference. Obviously, I didn't really need to add any more treble over on the active since there's plenty on tap. However, to get the passive in the same ballpark, I had to put a considerable boost in the treble frequencies. So before we get to listening to these back to back, let's just go back to that same sample and hear the passive in the mix. So as you'll hear, despite the intrinsic differences that both of these pickups have due to their construction, they're pretty close to the same type of tone. They both have that aggressive, biting top end. But as you heard, the passive still kind of sounds like it's got a little bit of a blanket over top of it. So let's mute the track, and let's just hear the way these two pickups sound just soloed. So again, here is the passive. And here is the active. So when they're soloed out, it's much easier to see that the active has plenty of treble on tap. And as you can see, I haven't even touched the treble knob. If we go over to the passive, you can see that I have a pretty considerable boost. I'm not necessarily comfortable giving it any more of that because I don't know if you heard, but I definitely heard there is a noticeable hiss in the top end. Hopefully you heard that hiss. Let's go to the same part on the active. Now, there's still a little bit of hiss there just because we're dealing with distortion. But between the two, the active is considerably quieter. And if I bump this treble up even further, you'll start to notice even more hiss comes in. However, that's actually even closer. Maybe it's a little more treble than the active has on board. That's maybe a little bit closer to what we want. Either way, the point is we have to do a considerable boost in the treble frequencies. And also, this is something that we're going to touch on a little bit later, but while we're here, we might as well notice the bit of compression that is happening in the active versus the passive. You can see here that the waves are much more even than they are down here. Where again, like I said, we're going to touch on that a little bit later, but it's just nice to notice while we're here. All right, so example number 2, we still are dealing with a rock song, actually the same artist as before. But this song does not necessarily call for a bright and aggressive bass tone. It's more of a pulsing, kind of low thump that we need for this one. So again, we're using the DI signal. I have the active and the passive played pretty much exactly the same each time. So let's just start by hearing the active DI signal completely uncolored and unprocessed. Now, that's probably much more top end than we would really realistically need in this track, but let's hear the passive. So the passive tone is a little bit closer to what we want. Again, it's still not exactly what we need because we're dealing with DI signals, but for what we're about to do, the DI signal just makes it a little bit better and easier to see. So let's just say that the active pickup was the only one that you had when you showed up to this particular session. Obviously, as we just heard, much more top end than we would ever need, but it still gives us plenty of room to sculpt, mold, and work with it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use Match EQ, and we're going to get this active DI signal to sound just about identical to this passive DI signal. And what we're going to do is it's going to analyze the current track, which is the active. It's going to reference our reference track, which in this case is going to be the passive, and then it's going to apply an EQ curve to the active to make it sound like the passive. Now, you can have it listen to the tracks, but I found it's easier in this case to just have them queued up and ready to go as files. So this song is Ride the Skies, so our current track is the active Ride the Skies DI. That's our current. It's analyzed the general frequency response of that track. Now we go to our reference track and we want the same song passive Ride the Skies DI. That's the reference track, and now we go to EQ curve and hit match. So that is the curve that it's going to apply to the active signal to get it sound like the passive. Now, by default, it smooths it out by 4 points. If you bring that back down to 0, you can see it's much more detailed, and then you can kind of find anywhere you want of how much smoothing you want. So let's go with, let's just stick with like 3. So before we listen to this, let's just turn it off and solo the bass and hear it as is, unprocessed. And now we'll kick this on. Now let's compare that to our passive. Back to the active. Okay, so we have a little bit more signal because it's adding some low end because this pickup is a little bit darker, this pickup is a little bit brighter, and the algorithm in this particular program is trying to compensate for all of it. Obviously, if you were in a real session with a real engineer, they wouldn't use Match EQ, but it's just a quick way to show how you can get this pickup to sound like the passive. So it's given us, we'll call it maybe 5 or 6 dB of low end, so we'll just bring our master fader down by 5.5. And then if we play them together, we should have about similar volume. And there we go. So using Match EQ, a lot of it, again, since this is relatively even, with the exception of this characteristic bump around 1.5, the majority of the focus is dipping out this 3K or so and above, just to kind of warm up the active to get some of those high-end frequencies out of there, and just to kind of get it to sit more like the passive. So again, here's uncolored. And colored. Okay, so let's try a bit more of an extreme example. Here again, we have the active DI, and we're going to compare that to the passive through the cabinet with the RE320 microphone. So let's start with just the active DI. And let's compare that to the passive pickup through the speaker. Okay, so obviously a pretty big difference there, but we're going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to use Match EQ. So our current track is this active DI. Drag that into current. And our reference track is the passive RE320. We're going to drag that into reference. And then we're going to match our EQ curves. Now, because we're dealing with the speaker and its characteristic, obviously we're adding a considerable amount of gain in some of these lower frequencies, an even bigger dip in the top frequencies than we've seen before. So it should be pretty obvious that this signal is going to be quite a bit louder than what we started. So I'm going to say it's somewhere between 15 and 20 dB, so we're just going to call it negative 17 here on the master fader to compensate. And let's again hear our passive signal through the microphone for reference. And here's our active with our match EQ. I mean, that's pretty spot on. Let's toggle back and forth between this. So even right there, we were able to take the active, DI, clean, clinical, sterile sound and inject some character into it with basically nothing more than EQ. Now, the last little bit that I want to talk about is compression. Active pickups have inherent compression due to the onboard preamp. Guitar players love to complain about this, but I see it as a plus for the bass community. Here's another challenge. Take a picture of your pedal board. I guarantee the majority of you have a compressor on board. And that's because we've all come to understand and appreciate the need for a consistent low end. But what a fraction of us utilize is serial compression. My friend Jamie Lewis refers to this as death by 1,000 cuts. Rather than burden one compressor with all of the work, distribute the load amongst two compressors. But in this case, one of those compressors is our pickup. Now, to be fair, the pickup doesn't produce a ton of compression, but it's still enough that it'll probably lighten your compressor's load, and you might even be able to decrease some of your settings.
Any amplification has some threshold for its reproduction of the signal and its amplification of the signal, beyond which it will start to compress. And what compression does to the signal, basically, there's a point at which your amplifier, which is specified to amplify your signal, say 10 times. Well, if you are in the middle of like a really aggressive slap pop riff that you're doing and you're sending a really hot signal, and especially if your battery is starting to kind of decrease in voltage because maybe it's been a few months since you've changed it, then you might find on these like really hard attacks that you're not getting like 10 times amplification out of that initial attack. It's getting clamped down a little bit, and that's what compression is. That's what people use a compressor pedal for. But yeah, compression is something that can happen based on certain constraints.
Now, you brought up the point of the battery starting to die, which I'm sure this information is readily available on the website, but I just want to get it from you. What is the average lifespan for the 9-volt battery in, say, this particular EMG Original P?
If it's just the P pickup and it's got no other powered accessories in it, just one pickup, yeah, I would say about 1,000 hours or so. I don't track it that way in my playing. Like I tend to change my battery maybe every 5 or 6 months, and I'm playing 10 to 15 hours a week maybe. Also, it depends how adamant you are about unplugging your instrument in between setting it down, because the battery is only engaged in the circuit when your instrument cable is plugged in. So if you're jamming and then you just set your instrument down while it's plugged in and go make yourself a sandwich and come back an hour later and keep playing, like your battery is being drained for that whole hour. So it depends on how people use it.
So on average, you said maybe twice a year. You could maybe even argue 4 times a year if you wanted to be a little extra cautious. But yeah, that doesn't really seem like a big deal to me.
No, and if people are so inclined to go with 18 volts, they'll get a little bit more headroom out of that, because that preamplifier that's in the pickup, it will start to compress like little by little beyond, definitely below 8 volts or so. Luckily, battery's voltage doesn't just decline linearly. It sort of has a plateau, and then toward the end of its life, it starts to dip down. I notice it when I get around like the 4-month mark, and I start thinking like, seems like I'm starting to sound like I just bent over and turned my compressor pedal up to a more aggressive setting, but I didn't. And it's usually then when I like, okay, it's been a few months since I've changed the battery. If I was running at 18 volts, I think that I could go a little bit, I could go longer potentially. And actually I play with an X series pickup set, because those pickups actually by design have a little more headroom in them. So I don't have to kind of worry so much about what the preamp's compression is doing to those like really aggressive attacks of like when I'm hitting aggressive. I'm kind of a ham-fisted player, to be honest. So I play pretty abrasively, and so yeah, I like the X series pickups. I just can think, okay, I'm doing myself as many favors as I can to have like a crisp and kind of open sound, no matter how hard I'm hitting it.
So what don't active pickups have that passives do? Well, in this particular experiment with these two pickups, I found that the active pickup doesn't quite have the same punch upon the initial strike that the passive does. Now, this could be due to a couple of different factors, either the fact that this pickup has a little bit of inherent compression due to the preamp, or that it utilizes a ceramic magnet. Now, I don't want to say that goes for all active pickups, just the one that we used in this video, because this bass, which is a fun bass in and of itself, and we'll get to it in another video, this bass features the EMG PJAX set. Now, that onslaught of initials basically means EMG, the company, PJ, the configuration, A for Alnico magnet, and X for the X series preamp. Now, with those pickups, you still get all of the benefits of active technology that we've touched on in this video, but with a sound that's a little bit closer to what you're accustomed to out of your passive pickup, that being from the Alnico magnets and the increased headroom in the preamp. There's also the CS line of pickups. CS stands for ceramic steel, and the introduction of the steel in combination with the ceramic is, again, it's going to shave off some of those unneeded top-end frequencies and get a little bit closer to a sound that you're accustomed to hearing.
One magnet versus the other, it's one variable versus the other, and you can have two Alnico pickups that sound very different from each other. Like, for example, like a traditional Strat pickup and a traditional Jazzmaster pickup. Okay, well, they're both Alnico single coils. Shouldn't they sound the same? They definitely do not sound the same because of all these other variables that we've been talking about in the construction. That said, Alnico is a metal in particular that has a high iron content. Steel screws or steel pole pieces also have iron. The introduction of iron inside of the coil increases that inductance, and so it shaves off more of those high ends. So that's part of the explanation of why people associate Alnico with a warmer sound. But ceramic has much lower iron content. It doesn't shave off as much of the highs because it doesn't have quite as much inductance. However, if you have a ceramic magnet and you put the steel pole pieces, then you're going to reintroduce that iron. You're going to have a warmer sound anyway. So like a pickup that's made with ceramic magnets but steel bars or steel pole pieces, the presence of the steel will warm up the sound. It will kind of taper off some of those highs in a way similar to what's happening with the Alnico.
Either way, I have noticed that the pickups in that Axe bass, because they're Alnico with the X series preamp, do have more punch on tap than that original piece ceramic. So maybe that one goes out the window. I don't know. The second thing that active pickups don't have is they don't have like an 80-year street cred that passives do. They weren't played by James Jamerson, Carol Kay, Chris Squire, or Geddy Lee on any of those early iconic recordings simply because they didn't exist. However, if Jamerson were starting out today, considering the fact that he was a session guy who, legend has it, plugged straight into the board, I'd be surprised if he wasn't using an active pickup. And finally, I want to leave you with this. Passive pickups don't sound bad. I'm going to iterate that one more time. Passive pickups do not sound bad. Not everything has to be so polarizing. The point of this video is not to say rip out all your passives and replace them all with actives. Of course, passives have earned their legacy that they've built over the last 60 years. They're simple, they're plug and play, and right out of the box, they're going to give you the tone that you've come to know, love, and expect over the last 60 or so years. The problem is that they're limited to that one sound. So the point that I'm trying to make is, first of all, if you've turned away from active pickups, give them a second look. And second, in the unfortunate circumstance that you're forced to give up all your instruments except one, you're better off with that one instrument being equipped with an active pickup. If you're the casual player or hobbyist who just likes to noodle for fun, don't waste your money switching out your pickups. You're fine with whatever came stock. But if you're gigging, recording, or in any way trying to get more serious about your tone, active should be a no-brainer. So that just about wraps it up for this video. Huge thank you to EMG for helping me make this project a reality, and of course, thank you all for watching. Let me know down below in the comments your thoughts on this topic, and while you're down there, give the video a like or a dislike, but either way, subscribe and ring the notification bell. That just about does it for me and all my hand motions, so until next time, be safe, and I'll see you later.